Thank you very much, Father. In the interest of time, I'll dispense with my thanks and well-crafted jokes. Allow me, though, to, in an effort to blend my topic into James Bond lore, I'd like to communicate to you the title of my presentation, which is From Russia with Love, From the West with Ambivalence, Orthodox Christian Relief During the Greek Revolution, and the New Historiography on Humanitarian Intervention. My very brief paper is focused, thank you. My very brief paper is focused on, concerned with the omission of Orthodox Christianity in the emerging scholarly literature on the origins of what today is understood as humanitarian intervention in world affairs. My study aims to situate the critical role of Orthodox Christian humanitarian relief originating in the Russian Empire in the first large-scale modern experience in international humanitarian intervention, namely the Greek Revolution, against the dominant pattern of historiographical construction in this very nascent field of study. To begin with, the premise of human rights, widely regarded as a fairly recent political development, is based on the idea that all human beings, as we know, are endowed with fundamental, inalienable, God-given rights that cannot be abrogated. Humanitarianism is understood and expressed as kindness, charity, and support for all human beings, especially those experiencing intense suffering and peril. Both human rights and humanitarianism, albeit phenomena separated across historical and cultural distance, are closely connected. They're closely connected in that they share religious origins and moral underpinnings. Now, regardless of its popular portrayal, it would be a mistake to assume that humanitarian intervention merely represents the forcible international protection, unrestrained by the conventions of state sovereignty, of human beings and human rights, or put differently, the direct involvement of one state or states in the domestic affairs of another state on behalf of populations whose lives and human rights are under attack by their own state. By that I mean the notion that humanitarian intervention can be traced to the deliberate fusion of humanitarianism and intervention in early 19th century Europe is not entirely accurate. Although the historical lineage of humanitarian intervention is clear, it did, indeed, first emerge in the 19th century and in Europe, especially, or I should say specifically in response to the Greek Revolution against Ottoman rule. The circumstances that shaped its evolution were more accidental than deliberate. Until the Greek Revolution of 1821, humanitarianism and interventionism were two separate concepts. For example, both intervention and humanitarianism, the latter in the form of relief efforts undertaken in different parts of Europe, had taken place during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars in the years shortly before the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence. Nonetheless, at no point during those conflicts was humanitarianism employed by any of the belligerents to justify intervention, or was intervention undertaken on behalf of humanitarianism. These two activities operated as they had historically, in completely separate spheres. Now, following the tumult of the Napoleonic Wars, the 1815 Congress of Vienna established the so-called European concert system. This was an international architecture dedicated to the preservation of stability, a balance of power between states. Binding together the European great powers, the concert system was premised upon unified opposition to radicalism, revolution, and threats to the territorial status quo. The Greek War of Independence, its revolutionary cause, its radical character, its assault against the imperial status quo, this threatened the very foundations, the purpose of the entire concert system. Now, initially, the reactions of the great powers to the Greek Revolution were muted. They did not extend beyond formal diplomatic complaints registered with the Sultan for his government's wave of atrocities committed against Greeks throughout the Ottoman Empire. However, popular reaction among European publics, elites and commoners alike, to the Greek Revolution, this was a very different matter. Philhellenism, in support of the Greek revolutionary cause, was widespread in European and in American society, where countless so-called Greek committees emerged to collect material, to collect financial aid for the Greek cause, and furthermore, to wage public awareness campaigns aimed at pressuring their governments, the great powers and even the United States, to intervene in the revolution in order to deliver humanitarian relief and physical protection to the Greeks. Despite their considerable efforts, interventionist Philhellenes did not exert a decisive influence on the great powers' policies, which remained committed to the status quo. In an ironic twist, however, the great powers' dedication to maintain stability, to maintain a balance of power, the status quo, led to a sequence of events that spiraled out of their control, leading to an unplanned, accidental, but enormous military engagement between the powers, the forces of the great powers, and the Turkish fleet, the Battle of Navarino in 1827, which of course resulted in British, French, Russian intervention in the revolution against the Ottomans. In short, the great powers' intervention in the Greek Revolution was the result of a miscalculated effort to actually avoid intervention based on their own realpolitik considerations, not a decision to act on humanitarian considerations. Of course, once it became clear after Navarino that a feeble Turkey would inexorably produce great power rivalries over the future disposition of Ottoman territory, it was understood by the individual great powers that upholding a very strict universal principle of non-intervention might work against their respective state interests. Consequently, it became clear to European governments that it would be difficult for them to engage in future interventions, which were likely in the Ottoman Empire, without the consideration and invocation, real or cynical, of humanitarian principles. So, albeit concentrated and galvanized by the Greek Revolution, the linkage between interventionism and humanitarianism was sequential rather than synchronous. It was a linkage that would establish also the theoretical and formal moral framework, as well as basic operational model for humanitarian interventionism to the present. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, the current practice of humanitarian intervention as an increasingly common feature in world affairs, this is something that has drawn the interest and influenced the works of scholars such as Michael Barnett, Michael Bass, and David Rodogno, all of them the leading scholars in the nascent field of the history of humanitarianism. Now, the work of these scholars, although impressive in many respects, is also representative of the dominant approach to the history of humanitarianism, meaning it is overshadowed and informed by the political and moral debates that preoccupy contemporary policymakers and activists today. In other words, it relies on presentism that makes convenient sense of humanitarian intervention in the past in ways that legitimize and comport with its exercise in the present. The similarities between these and other scholars' works are not limited, however, to this presentist orientation. For example, they all subscribe to the consensus that humanitarian intervention was an unintended consequence of the Greek Revolution, and that humanitarian interventionism evolved through the great powers' subsequent involvement in the Ottoman Empire. Furthermore, they all acknowledge to varying degrees that religion was the critical antecedent to humanitarianism and hence humanitarian interventionism. However, their historiographical treatment of religion has led to the construction of an exclusively Western-centric and thus truncated narrative of the history of humanitarianism. Now, according to this formulation, Western Christianity, understood chiefly as Protestantism, Western Christianity, as an abolitionist force against slavery, had, according to this thinking, earlier created distinctive models of humanitarian advocacy that would be crystallized as humanitarian intervention during the Greek Revolution. Remarkably, in this narrative, there is no role, there is no importance, there is not even relevance given to Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox Christianity, which of course represented the religion of both the Greeks, who were at the very center of the historical events which shaped modern humanitarian interventionism, and Russia, which would provide more humanitarian relief to the Greeks than any other state. The omission of orthodoxy in Russia from the historical record is striking. For example, Rodogno writes extensively about Britain and about Protestant Christians in relation to the Greek Revolution and humanitarianism. Russia, however, exists in his narrative only as a rival or threat to British interests in the Mediterranean, never as an actor involved in the humanitarian concerns of the time. Moreover, In the first roughly 100 pages, that section of his very influential book, Rodogno's book, Against Massacre, Humanitarian Intervention in the Ottoman Empire, in the first roughly 100 pages of this book, the section dedicated to the Greek Revolution, Rodogno uses the term Orthodox Christianity twice, instead using the vague Ottoman Christians as a label for Greek Orthodox Christians. Rodogno's orientalizing language has the effect of trivializing and expunging the presence of Orthodoxy from its own geographic space and its own historical experience. This action underscores just one of the many ideological and methodological problems associated with this Western-centric approach, namely, its willingness to expropriate and use the history of the Orthodox world while ignoring Orthodoxy itself in order to construct a narrative about culture, religion, and history in and of the West. Now, in order to map more completely the humanitarian response to the Greek Revolution, it's important to turn to the Russian case and consider the significant role played by Russia and Orthodoxy, which, as I just noted, have been entirely omitted from the conventional treatment of humanitarian intervention. 2 points are salient here. First, the substantial and pivotal role played by Russia in providing humanitarian aid to the Greeks, and second, the relevance of Orthodoxy. The relevance of Orthodoxy is a conceptual driver for Russian humanitarianism. In the only study of its kind, the 1994 publication Russian Society and the Greek Revolution by Theophilis Prousis observes that, quote, the Orthodox faith that the Greeks and Russians shared, along with a chain of historical affinities that stretched from the Middle Ages to the present, shaped the context in which Russians embraced the Phil-Hellenic movement. Prousis makes it clear that the Turks' brutal depredations against Orthodox Christians in the Balkans and Asia Minor, culminating symbolically in, quote, the fate of the ecumenical patriarch, transformed Russian support from the Greek cause into a religious and national crusade, end quote. Here it's worth noting, I think, that despite Prousis' exhaustive research and his seminal contribution to our understanding of Russia and the Greek Revolution and Russian Orthodox humanitarianism, his book is not cited, it is not referenced in any of the major studies on the history of humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention. To move on to the subject of humanitarian action itself, Russian aid efforts for the Greeks did not wait for the Russian state to finally move in 1827 in concert with France and Britain to intervene in the Greek Revolution and to go to war in 1828 against the Ottoman Empire. Tsar Alexander's government and Russian society found common cause during the Greek War of Independence by organizing and funding humanitarian relief for Greeks. More so than any other manifestation of Russian Phil-Hellenism, humanitarian relief was the product of Russia's Orthodox humanitarian values and Russia's Orthodox ties to the Greek world. The Russians' first humanitarian action aimed at providing aid to Greek refugees. By late April 1821, only 1 month after the outbreak of the revolution, several thousand refugees had poured across the Ottoman border from Moldavia into Russian Bessarabia, or had sailed in flight to Odessa. In early May, the Russian Foreign Ministry reported to the central government in St. Petersburg that Russia had a religious obligation and a humanitarian imperative to help all refugees. Immediate help to the refugees was already being provided by local authorities and by private charities, when in July, Tsar Alexander instructed Prince Alexander N. Golitsyn, his head of the dual Ministry of Religious Affairs and Public Education, to mobilize and coordinate a nationwide relief effort. Accordingly, on July the 24th, 1821, Golitsyn officially launched the relief campaign in a state announcement that invoked Orthodox philanthropy and humanitarian motives. Guided by Golitsyn, the relief effort, which relied on donations from the imperial family, the Tsar estate, local governments, the Orthodox Church, nobility, the ordinary people of Russia, merchants, townspeople, peasants, to fund its extensive operations. The relief campaign had and established 2 chief objectives. 1, to help the more than 50,000 Orthodox Christian refugees who had fled to Russia, and 2, to free the more than 100,000 Greeks who had been abducted and enslaved by the Turks in retribution for the revolt. In addition to these original objectives, after 1827 in the intervention of the great powers in revolutionary Greece, Russian aid was extended to alleviate famine in the Peloponnesus, that is, in the far south of Greece. The Russian humanitarian campaign was very remarkably successful, in fact, in providing critical emergency aid and long-term support to refugees and to the starving. Conversely, Russia's efforts to pay the ransoms and buy the freedom of enslaved Greeks was, although not without some results, considerably less successful, owing primarily to the problems of dispersal and disappearance of the enslaved and the lack of reliable intermediaries and regular mechanisms to facilitate their liberation. The decade-long relief effort that brought together the people and resources of the Tsarist state, the Orthodox Church, virtually every segment and strata of Russian society, in an unprecedented modern national humanitarian campaign was longer sustained, more sophisticated, more successful in aiding more people, especially refugees, than any of the relief programs organized by Philhellenes in Britain, France, and the United States. What set Russia apart from its great partners and America? What accounted for Russia's extraordinary pioneering model of a national humanitarian relief effort? If the unique architecture, if the incredible sophistication of the Russian relief campaign, that is, a state-sponsored and supported effort that provided the organizational centralization and means to coordinate the activities of a diverse array of groups, communities, institutions, individuals scattered across a vast empire, if this was the key to Russia's success as an international humanitarian actor, then its context and purpose was provided by Orthodox Christianity. Russia's Greek relief effort was, of course, influenced by a host of factors, some of which were irrelevant to considerations of religion. Nonetheless, nothing drove Russian humanitarianism more than orthodoxy. The Orthodox traditions of philanthropy and humanitarianism, and an earnest dedication to, quite literally, in their view, save the lives and souls of Orthodox Christians accounts in large measure for the Russians' deep identification with the Greeks and for their extraordinary record of accomplishment in humanitarian relief. Golitsyn's official proclamation of November 1822, announcing the inauguration of the campaign to pay the ransom and liberate the enslaved Greeks, provides us with a clear indication of the Orthodox sensibilities and values as well as religious motives that formed the character and moral purpose of what Tsarist officialdom called the humanitarian deed. Golitsyn made an impassioned appeal to the Russian people that the plight of the enslaved Greeks offered an opportunity for Russians, inspired by Orthodox faith and humanity, to rescue their co-religionists cut off from the Church of Christ. He wrote, quote, "Now is the time to show that fortune and wealth have value only when used for the salvation of neighbors. To return them to the fold of the Church, this is a feat worthy of charitable zeal for all friends of humanity." To conclude, the complete omission of orthodoxy from this history impedes a more comprehensive, a more accurate understanding of the emergence of the conceptions and practices of humanitarianism, humanitarian intervention, and finally human rights as well. Many Western scholars may imagine that humanitarianism is a fairly recent Western innovation, that it can be traced almost exclusively to Protestantism, but such conceit requires that scholars ignore the highly evolved, sophisticated, institutionalized, and widespread Orthodox traditions already talked about today, traditions of charity, philanthropy, and aid, in a word, humanitarianism. Features that were central to the life and society of Byzantium, a civilization whose global imprint, as Dr. Miller talked about quite well, was global and far greater than formerly imagined. Furthermore, these ancient Orthodox practices were diffused across the Byzantine cultural commonwealth, preserved through historical continuity, evolved and manifest arguably in the modern era in Russia, eventually in the form of this unprecedented humanitarian relief effort. By ignoring the role of orthodoxy as a contributing factor in the Christian origins of humanitarianism, and by sidestepping the role of Orthodox Russia in the subsequent emergence of humanitarian intervention, we limit our understanding of both humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention. Thank you very much.